February 22nd of 2019 was a big day for the employees at BioWare. It was Anthem Day. To mark the occasion, they gathered outside of their respective offices for a cheery photo to celebrate the release of one of the most anticipated games of 2019. Hidden behind those four smiles were 7 years of development filled with struggle and sacrifice. Struggle and sacrifice that were met with almost universal criticism. Despite promising initial sales figures, the game has been all but rejected by players. It's no exaggeration to say that Anthem has been nothing short of a disaster for BioWare, one that follows the steaming pile of disappointment that was 2016's Mass Effect Andromeda. Prior to these two titles, BioWare was seen as an industry darling, a hit factory that made some of the most acclaimed titles of all time. Just 10 years separates the near-perfect original Mass Effect and the tragic fourth entry Andromeda. So, what happened? It's easy to blame the financially driven meddling of EA or the various stories of mismanagement, but what about the very software designed to facilitate the studio's wildest ambitions? This is Game Changers, and this is the story of how EA's Frostbite engine almost ruined BioWare. What do Baldur's Gate, Knights of the Old Republic, and the Mass Effect trilogy have in common? Induction into my theoretical RPG Hall of Fame aside, they are all developed by BioWare. Since its foundation in 1995, the Canadian studio has become renowned for delivering in-depth writing, dialogue, and player choice alongside meaningful combat systems and character progression. But their life as an independent studio came to an end when, between 2005 to 2007, a series of corporate acquisitions led to them being wholly owned by EA, a company with a reputation for bringing about the premature deaths of countless studios. But BioWare were different. BioWare seemed almost invulnerable. Aside from a dodgy ending in its third entry, the Mass Effect trilogy, released under EA, was one of the best received RPG series ever. Multiplayer, countless amounts of DLC, and even microtransactions made their way into the games, but EA's traditional BS did little to taint Mass Effect. Ultimately, BioWare seemed to have all the breathing room required to tell the stories they had become known for. There was only one problem. The trilogy had been developed on Unreal Engine 3, game engine owned by Epic Games. That means some of that sweet Mass Effect money was lost in licensing fees to Epic, and we're not exactly talking pocket change either. Take Unreal Engine 4 for example. It's readily available and free to all developers. The catch? Epic take 5% of gross product revenue after the first $3,000. When creating and shipping a $60 product, $3,000 gross revenue represents just 50 sales. To put EA's predicament into perspective, the original Mass Effect trilogy shifted 14 million units by 2014. It's not surprising that it wasn't long before EA decided to roll the dice and make a game engine all of their own. Battlefield 3 might not seem like a significant turning point in gaming history, but for EA and by extension BioWare, it was a seminal moment. This was a title published by EA, developed by an EA studio, and designed on an EA-owned engine, Frostbite 2. Released in 2011 to critical acclaim, Battlefield 3 was a technical marvel. The multiplayer component was visceral, with explosive firefights taking place over an expansive, fully destructible environment, and it was all driven by Frostbite 2. But whoa, Jamie, I hear you saying, what about Frostbite 1? Well, back in 2006, EA acquired Swedish studio DICE, the masterminds behind the Battlefield series. Rather than putting them to work pumping out new games immediately, their new overlord set DICE an additional task: build a game engine. They did just that, and it debuted with Battlefield Bad Company in 2008. At that stage, Frostbite seemed like it would only be appropriate for explosive, destructive first-person shooters, a fact that EA themselves didn't seem too concerned with. After all, they've built other in-house engines for very specific purposes. Take Ignite, for example, an engine built entirely to house EA Sports' annualized sports titles. Frostbite, however, would take a different path after its success in delivering Battlefield 3. The reliability with which it could seemingly churn out high-end environments that would play home to complex and cinematic physics made EA take notice. The engine soon became an attractive prospect for executives keen to save money, but also ambitious studios willing to tackle the powerful new software's potential. The first three studios outside of DICE to have a go at taming this technological beast had an incredible amount of pedigree between them. First, there was Black Box, the brains behind the Skate trilogy and a decade's worth of Need for Speed games. Next up was Danger Close, who developed every single console outing in the Medal of Honor series, from the original PlayStation 1 entry to Frontline and Rising Sun on the PS2. And finally, there was Visceral Games, who'd given us the Dead Space series. Let's see how these three got on when using the Frostbite engine for the first time. Three great studios, three shit games. One thing in common: Frostbite. Despite these early warning signs, Frostbite had yet to get its reputation for being an impenetrable piece of software. DICE ensured it was shown off in all its glory whenever a new entry in the Battlefield series arrived, and outside failures that occurred along the way were brushed aside. Instead, EA embraced Frostbite as their own proprietary engine and began transferring every internal property they could to it. Licensing fees would be a thing of the past, and over time it would, in theory, bring all of EA's internal studios closer together, allowing them to share experiences. As EA Sports Executive Vice President Cam Weber explained,
"And it wasn't just about making game development better and improving the quality of our games and the efficiency of what we can build. It was something that we saw was going to be a great benefit to us."
As EA were enjoying the success of the Battlefield franchise, BioWare was struggling to breathe new life into one of theirs. Dragon Age 2, the sequel to their extremely popular RPG Dragon Age Origins, had been met with mixed reviews in 2011, with the game's storytelling and dialogue systems, elements which BioWare were renowned for, coming under scrutiny. Combined with the initial fallout around Mass Effect 3, they suddenly found themselves at a creative crossroads. Despite the success they'd had with Mass Effect and Dragon Age, they'd yet to house any of the games in an open world, a fact that looked increasingly out of place as titles like Skyrim stole the hearts of RPG fans around the world. But the team weren't convinced that their in-house Eclipse engine, which delivered the first two entries, would be up to the task. No prizes for guessing where they landed in their search for a new game engine: Frostbite. Not really surprising given they turned to Patrick Solan for advice, one of the higher-ups at EA and the man who personally oversaw the creation of the engine. At this point it should be noted that EA has never, strictly speaking, forced one of their teams to adopt the engine. As far as we know, BioWare made the final call themselves. On paper, the studio now had a suite of tools fit to create their own Skyrim, and the result of this newfound potential was Dragon Age Inquisition. Make no mistake about it though, this wasn't an easy time. After all, nobody had ever made an RPG on Frostbite before. The amount of work needed to make Frostbite fit for purpose came as a nasty shock to BioWare. In the early stages of development, the team found that fulfilling even the most basic of instructions was impossible. Even the game's cinematic designers were struggling to work with the tools at hand in order to create the game's cutscenes. Despite all of this, a full-blown panic never truly set in, because BioWare knew they had access to a wealth of knowledge in the Frostbite team at DICE. The issue? That team are based in Stockholm, a whole 8 hours ahead of the BioWare team in Edmonton, which wasn't exactly ideal for efficient communication. Plus, the Frostbite team had their own shit to deal with, namely constantly improving and updating the engine. Problem was, having a constantly evolving engine to work with wasn't exactly helpful for the folks at BioWare. Against this backdrop, the team were frantically working to hit a 2013 release to satisfy EA and allow Inquisition to launch alongside the latest generation of consoles. It just didn't happen. A huge commercial opportunity was lost as BioWare took an extra year to get the game finished. In fact, Mark Dara at one point claimed that the game had an incredible 90,000 bugs in it, a number he maintains wasn't hyperbolic. Although this delay caused tension between BioWare and EA, it was ultimately a good thing. Released on November 18, 2014, Inquisition became the fastest-selling Dragon Age game ever. A hit with both fans and critics, it was even named Game of the Year by IGN. But having the public accept the game did little to shine a light on the struggles the team had worked through, and some individuals began to worry that all their stress, crunch and overtime would be for nothing, as most people would come away from the game without an inkling of the engine's shortcomings. Frostbite, it appeared, had been saved by the BioWare magic. EA were pleased that the idea of Frostbite plus BioWare equals big money had proven true, so it didn't take long for that formula to be applied to BioWare's marquee franchise, Mass Effect. With the original trilogy complete, the series could go in almost any direction, and, perhaps with this in mind, BioWare switched the lead development of the game to their Montreal studio, while the Big Daddy BioWare Edmonton began work on a new IP codenamed Dylan. This new team had some bold ideas for Mass Effect. They wanted to make a game about exploration, giving players the ability to visit hundreds of planets. Forget Reapers, forget Shepard. Mass Effect Andromeda was to be a fresh take on the franchise, all built within Frostbite. It would have been fair to assume that the second time using Frostbite would be easier for BioWare, but look at the difference between Andromeda and Inquisition, and you'll see how untrue that was. How did a game that came out later manage to take so many steps back? Why, for example, did the quality of the animations worsen over time? Put simply, Frostbite didn't have an animation system, so animation rigs had to be made from scratch for each game. Naturally, with two different teams solving problems in two different ways, the results would differ greatly. Regrettably, the solutions that the Andromeda team ended up finding were poor. Essentially, the Andromeda team had to rework large chunks of the engine from scratch. In other words, a lot of the lessons and tools gained from Inquisition were useless. It was issues like these that led to the differences between Inquisition and Andromeda. Then there was the central premise of exploration, with BioWare hoping players would travel between and land on hundreds of different planets. The team were even interested in No Man's Sky-like procedural generation in the pursuit of creating expansive, rich planets that took full advantage of Frostbite's power. Even here the engine let them down. The planets they were creating were too big, and Frostbite simply couldn't handle them. Released in March of 2017, Andromeda was considered BioWare's worst game to date. It soon became the laughingstock of the internet, with GIFs and videos of wonky animations and hideous faces being shared everywhere. So how did BioWare produce such a glitch fest? The answers soon began to reveal themselves courtesy of journalists like Jason Schreier, who, I should add, practically made this whole video possible with his work, and I highly recommend you check out his writing. Now, I'm sure you're expecting me to say that Frostbite is the reason behind this failure, and no doubt it played a part, but if the Inquisition team managed to get the job done despite the adversity, why didn't it come together this time? Well, for a start, it emerged there was conflict between the Edmonton and Montreal studios. Accusations were made that Project Dylan's Edmonton team were trying to sabotage Andromeda by stealing their ideas. When you add in intense periods of crunch and a troubled 5-year development, you're left with a game largely put together in the final 18 months. Perhaps then, rather than point the finger of blame at Frostbite, it should point to BioWare's upper management. They failed to foster good relations between their studios, they relied on crunch to complete the game, and they decided to use Frostbite despite knowing its issues. Hoping we'd all forgotten about Andromeda, in June 2017 BioWare revealed Dylan to the world as Anthem, a brand new IP. An early demo promised a lush open world ready to be explored by players as they soared through the sky, weaved between trees, and dived underwater. Surely the third outing on Frostbite would be different. The tools had been assembled, the team was well equipped to deal with its inadequacies, and BioWare were ready to use the software to its full potential. That might have been the case if the game had been a traditional RPG, but an online-only action RPG similar to Bungie's Destiny was different to anything the studio had handled before. Senior leadership made the decision once again to start from scratch for a large part of the game's tech, rather than using the tools they developed for Inquisition or Andromeda. All of the time the team had spent familiarizing themselves with Frostbite had been undone. 7 years after the studio had voluntarily adopted the software, it felt like they were still coming to terms with its inability to adapt to different games. Whether they were pressured by EA to stick with the technology in spite of their wishes is something we'll never know. But responding with astonishment at how inflexible Frostbite can be while creating your third game in the engine, especially after throwing out all the work you did on the previous 2 titles, reeks of insanity. The result was BioWare's worst game to date. I know, you've heard that one before. On release, Anthem felt unfinished, filled with bugs and glitches considered unacceptable at the AAA level. Sadly, even the content itself seemed remarkably thin and un-BioWare-like. Their trademark writing and character development was inconsistent at best, and the world they created was underwhelming. The game simply wasn't up to BioWare standards, and it wasn't long before critics and fans alike had taken out their pitchforks and EA had a target on their back. But many of the presumptions people have since made about EA's involvement in the project have turned out to be false. Namely, they didn't force BioWare to make a Destiny-like game, and they didn't shape the development of the game to create as many monetization hooks as possible. Despite people's perception of EA's involvement, it would seem BioWare largely acted on their own in deciding to pursue their vision for Anthem, much like they did many years ago when they made the decision to adopt Frostbite. The Anthem debacle has undoubtedly eroded faith in BioWare even further amongst gamers, a high-profile failure that also threw the spotlight onto Frostbite itself. But it wasn't Frostbite that decided on a 7-year development cycle for Anthem, where almost all the work was scrambled together in the final 2, a process that left employees escaping into private rooms just to cry or taking 3-month breaks for the sake of their mental health. Put simply, Andromeda and Anthem's problems were caused by people, not technology. The more their high-profile shortcomings penetrate mainstream news, and the more Kotaku articles that catch the eye of gamers, the more BioWare find themselves under the microscope. Frostbite's shortcomings should do nothing to distract from the larger issues at hand. BioWare did this to themselves. So, did Anthem ruin BioWare? It's too early to tell, but they're certainly reeling. Another high-profile failure laced with traces of Frostbite's shortcomings simply cannot happen. Perhaps it should be on EA to acknowledge the incompatibility between the two and give the studio space to breathe. BioWare would take comfort in the fact that Respawn, the high-profile studio behind the Titanfall games, seem to have retained the freedom to operate on their own terms. The fact that Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, EA's other big commercial bet for 2019, will run on the Unreal Engine, be free from microtransactions, and be story-driven shows EA can't take all the blame for what happened with Anthem. As for BioWare themselves, they revealed a new Dragon Age game at the Game Awards in December 2018. Some interpreted it to be a show of confidence, a reminder that more was coming and it wasn't reliant on the success of Anthem. However, stories have already emerged detailing how the game has already gone through multiple iterations, and the tension between EA's financial goals and BioWare's desire to make one of their games is already palpable. The end result? A game that, if rumors are to be believed, is to deliver the studio's trademark storytelling and world building, but include enough games as a service elements to appease EA. On top of all of that, it'll run on Frostbite. All I can say is, good luck.